The sky above the dense forest was a tumultuous sea of dark clouds, swirling and crackling with anticipation. A storm was coming. Alaric stood on the edge of a cliff, looking out over the valley below. The wind howled as it ruffled his cloak, but his thoughts were focused inward. He had come a long way, battling not just his enemies, but the demons within. Every decision, every step, had led him to this moment. His past was a shadow, lingering just behind him, pushing him forward. The whispers of those he had wronged echoed in his mind, their faces haunting him. But none of them had ever understood the price of survival. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cold air. "What is vengeance if it can never be enough?" he muttered to himself. The answer was simple: it's never enough. The feeling that had driven him for years was beginning to unravel. Alaric had been a warrior, but now, as he stood at the precipice, he wasn't sure which path to take. His resolve wavered for the first time in years. As the wind howled around him, Alaric heard footsteps approaching from behind. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Maris, his old comrade, stood silently behind him. She had always known how to approach him in moments like this, when his mind was clouded and his heart uncertain. "The storm's not going to wait for you to decide, you know," she said softly, her voice calm but laced with concern. Alaric sighed deeply, but didn't respond. "I know you're tired," Maris continued, "tired of this never-ending war inside yourself. But you can't escape it by running, Alaric. The answers you're looking for aren't in the storm. They're in you." Alaric turned slightly, meeting her gaze. "And if I'm wrong?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if seeking revenge is the only way to make it stop?" Maris took a step forward, her eyes steady. "Then you'll never stop, Alaric. Vengeance is a prison, not a solution." Alaric's gaze dropped to the ground, conflicted, but deep down, he knew she was right. Maris stepped closer, her voice steady, yet filled with the weight of years of shared struggle. "We've fought together for so long, Alaric, but you can't fight this war alone anymore. I've seen the toll it's taken on you, the way it's eating at your soul. You don't have to face this battle by yourself." Alaric turned his gaze to the horizon, his eyes filled with pain. "What if I can't stop? What if the bloodshed is the only way to silence the voices that haunt me?" Maris stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his arm. "You have to try, Alaric. You've seen the cost of vengeance. Look at all we've lost in this war. All the lives destroyed." Her voice softened. "Do you really want to become everything you've hated?" Alaric's throat tightened as her words struck deep. The storm seemed to pause for a moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint rustling of the wind. Alaric finally lowered his sword, the weight of the weapon feeling like a burden in his hands. "I've always believed that vengeance was the answer," he confessed, his voice low. "But now I don't know what I believe anymore." Maris smiled softly, the warmth of her presence offering a sense of calm. "It's not easy, Alaric, letting go of a lifetime of hatred, of anger. But it's the only way to truly free yourself." Her gaze softened as she took a step back. "I've seen the goodness in you, Alaric, even when you couldn't see it in yourself." Alaric looked at her, the vulnerability in his eyes slowly turning into something else. "Hope. Do you think I can change?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maris nodded gently. "You're already changing." The wind shifted once more, and Alaric felt a sudden clarity in his chest. "Maybe I've been wrong all along," he said, more to himself than to Maris. "Maybe there is another way." Maris smiled softly, a look of pride in her eyes. "There's always another way, Alaric. You just have to be willing to see it." The storm began to dissipate, and the sky cleared as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Alaric turned toward the valley below, a new sense of purpose in his steps. "I'm ready," he said with determination, ready to face what comes next. Maris nodded, her eyes unwavering. Then we walked together. As they turned to leave the cliff, the storm finally broke, the sun now rising over the valley, casting a warm golden light across their path. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Alaric felt ready. The night was thick with tension as Alaric, still reeling from the confrontation, paced through the forest with rapid strides. The moon hung high above, casting pale light on the path ahead. Maris had followed him silently, her presence a comforting shadow, but even she could sense the weight of his thoughts. The air was heavy, filled with the sounds of the wild, yet nothing could drown the silence between them. Alaric's mind churned with the decision he had yet to make. He could feel the pull of vengeance, the fire that burned deep within him, but the path he walked was clouded with doubt. Maris watched him carefully, her voice breaking the stillness. "You cannot let your anger drive you forever," she said softly. "The heart that seeks revenge is never free." Alaric stopped in his tracks, his back stiff. Yet he didn't turn to face her. His jaw clenched as the weight of her words settled on him. Alaric finally turned to face her, his eyes hard yet filled with a depth of emotion. "You don't understand," he said, his voice raw. "They took everything from me. How can I stand by and do nothing?" Maris approached, her footsteps silent on the forest floor. She placed a hand gently on his arm, urging him to meet her gaze. "What will you become if you seek only vengeance?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Alaric shook his head, frustration evident in the tightness of his expression. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I can't let this go, not yet." The wind rustled through the trees, a distant howl of wolves rising in the background, as though nature itself felt the conflict within him. A long silence hung in the air before Maris spoke again, her voice breaking through the thick stillness. "Revenge may give you momentary satisfaction," she said quietly, "but it will never heal the wounds in your heart. It will only open more." Alaric looked away, his gaze lost in the distant horizon where the trees gave way to the darkness. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword, a sign of the battle within. "And what would you have me do?" he asked, his voice low and raw. "Turn the other cheek and wait for them to strike again?" Maris shook her head slowly, her expression filled with quiet determination. "No," she replied, "but the path you're on will lead you further into darkness. Is that the legacy you want?" The weight of her words settled in the air, heavy and unyielding. Alaric's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the fire of his resolve seemed to flicker. "I don't know if I can live with myself if I don't act," he confessed, his voice strained. Maris studied him, her eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and sorrow. "And yet," she said softly, "what if you lose yourself in the process? What if you become no different than the ones you seek to destroy?" Alaric remained silent, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He turned away, staring into the dark void of the forest, his thoughts spiraling. The forest around them was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves and distant calls of creatures in the night, but the stillness between them felt as though it stretched for eternity. After what felt like an eternity, Alaric spoke again, his voice quieter this time, resigned yet still burning with unresolved anger. "I don't have the luxury of time," he said. "If I don't act, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror again." Maris approached him slowly, her voice calm but firm. "Alaric," she said, her gaze unwavering, "acting out of vengeance will not bring you peace. You'll carry that rage with you forever, even after the blood is spilled." He closed his eyes briefly, taking a deep breath as he attempted to push the weight of her words away. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, the frustration clear in his tone. "How do I live with myself after everything they've done?" Maris reached out and touched his shoulder gently. "By choosing to be more than what they made you," she said quietly. The air had grown colder as Alaric and Maris trekked deeper into the forest, the weight of their conversation lingering between them like an unspoken promise. Alaric's steps were slower now, his mind still wrestling with the temptation of vengeance. The trees around them were towering, their thick branches blocking out much of the moonlight, and the forest felt almost claustrophobic. Maris had been silent for some time, giving him the space to think, but the silence between them was beginning to wear thin. Finally, Alaric broke it. "How do I know what's right anymore?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. I've spent so long holding on to this anger that I can't see any other way forward. Maris stopped walking, turning to face him. That's the first step, she said quietly. Acknowledging that the anger is blinding you. It's not the way forward, Alaric. There's another path. But it's hard to see when all you focus on is revenge. Her words cut through him, deeper than he wanted them to. He had known this truth but hadn't been ready to face it. Alaric met her gaze, his expression still clouded with uncertainty. What if I can't let go? What if I can't move on from this rage? His voice trembled slightly, a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. Maris stepped closer, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his thoughts. You have to want to let go, she said softly. You have to believe that there's something better waiting for you on the other side of this. Alaric scoffed bitterly, the doubt and frustration visible in his eyes. What if there isn't, he retorted. What if there's nothing left but the consequences of my choices? Maris gently placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. Then you live with them, she said simply. But you don't have to face them alone. That's why I'm here. Her words, simple yet profound, cut through his doubts like a blade, but they didn't provide immediate comfort. They only made him realize how isolated he had been in his quest for revenge. Alaric's gaze softened as Maris's words sank in, but his mind remained torn. I don't know if I can forgive them, he admitted quietly, the weight of his past still heavy on his chest. They've taken so much, and it feels like it would be a betrayal to let them off the hook. Maris's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes were full of understanding. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what was done to you, she said. It means freeing yourself from the anger that controls you. It means choosing peace even when it feels impossible. Alaric closed his eyes for a moment, the darkness around him reflecting the darkness inside. I don't know how to let go, he confessed. I've held on to this for so long, I don't know who I am without it. Maris took a step closer, her voice gentle. Then you have to find out. You have to take the first step into the unknown, Alaric, or you'll be stuck forever. The forest was quieter now, the only sounds the rustling of the leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Alaric stood still, his mind racing. The weight of Maris's words pressed on him, urging him to choose a different path. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that there was peace to be found beyond vengeance. But the fire of rage still burned in his chest. I don't know if I'm strong enough, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Maris's hand once again rested on his arm, firm but gentle. You don't have to be strong enough for everything, Alaric, she said quietly. Just strong enough to take the first step. That's all it takes. Alaric looked up at her, her eyes unwavering. She believed in him, even when he couldn't believe in himself. The weight of her faith in him was both overwhelming and comforting. He turned slowly, his gaze still uncertain, but a flicker of something, hope perhaps, shone through the darkness. Without another word, Alaric took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the decision that loomed before him. For a moment, the forest around them felt suffocating, but with each exhale, the air seemed to clear. The anger inside him didn't disappear, but it began to shift, no longer the driving force behind his actions. I don't know what lies ahead, he said softly, but I'll try, for you and for myself. Maris smiled, a small but genuine expression. That's all anyone can do, she said, her voice full of reassurance. Alaric looked back into the depths of the forest, the path ahead still uncertain, but no longer entirely shrouded in darkness. I'll take the first step, he whispered, and in that moment, something within him shifted. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying began to lift. The journey through the forest continued, but the air was different now. The silence felt lighter, not oppressive. Alaric found himself walking beside Maris, the weight of his past still heavy, but no longer holding him down. With every step, he could feel the anger that once consumed him beginning to loosen its grip. They reached a clearing as the sun began to rise, casting a warm, golden light across the grass. The sound of birdsong filled the air, a stark contrast to the heavy silence of the forest. Maris glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. "How are you feeling?" she asked gently. Alaric took a deep breath, his heart still heavy but lighter than it had been in days. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think I can finally breathe again." Maris nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. "You'll find your way, Alaric. I know you will." He nodded back, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered. "I don't think I could have done this alone." As the day wore on, they traveled further into the land, the landscape beginning to shift from dense forest to open plains. The journey was long, and Alaric's thoughts remained heavy with the choices ahead. He hadn't fully reconciled with his past, but the small steps he had taken felt like a start. Maris, ever watchful, had noticed the shift in him, less rigid, more open, but she also knew that the hardest part was still to come. "Alaric," she began, her voice soft yet steady, "there's something we need to talk about." He turned to face her, his expression wary. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "The road to redemption is not easy. There will be times when you feel the pull of your past, when anger and regret rise again. You have to be prepared for that." Alaric's face grew serious as he considered her words. "I don't know if I can do this alone," he confessed. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Maris smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Alaric. You never have been. And you don't have to do this alone." The words of reassurance hung in the air between them as they continued their journey. As night approached, they made camp in a small, sheltered grove, the sounds of the world around them settling into the quiet of evening. Alaric sat by the fire, his gaze distant as he poked at the embers. The crackling of the fire was the only sound breaking the silence. Maris sat across from him, her eyes soft but focused. She had watched him closely over the past few days, seeing the internal battle he was fighting. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Maris looked up, confused. "Regret what?" she asked. Alaric's voice was low, almost a whisper. "Choosing this path. Choosing to fight back against everything that's been done to me." Maris thought for a long moment before speaking. "No," she replied simply. "I don't regret it. Every choice has led me to where I am now, and I wouldn't change that, even if it means facing hard truths." Alaric nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the stick he was holding. "Maybe I'm not ready to forgive them, not yet," he admitted, "but I think I can at least move forward." The following days were filled with quiet reflection and long stretches of silent walking. As they neared the edge of the kingdom, Alaric began to feel the weight of the journey's end pressing in on him. His past was still there, lingering like a shadow, but he could see the horizon ahead, something brighter, something worth striving for. One evening, as they sat atop a hill overlooking the distant valley, Alaric spoke again. "I can feel it, Maris. The past is never far behind, but I think I can finally leave it behind." Maris turned to him, her eyes bright with a mixture of pride and relief. "That's all we can ever do, Alaric. Leave it behind and keep walking forward." He smiled, the first genuine smile in a long time, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you for showing me the way." She nodded, her gaze soft but firm. "You showed yourself the way, Alaric. You've always had the strength you needed. You just had to see it." The next morning, as they descended into the valley, the sense of finality weighed heavily on Alaric. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but he knew that for the first time in years, he had a choice. He could continue down the path of vengeance, or he could step into something new, something undefined, but full of possibility. Maris had been a constant presence, a steady guide through the darkest parts of his soul. But now, as they walked side by side, he realized that the journey was his alone to finish. "I'm ready," he said finally, his voice filled with quiet resolve. Maris gave him a knowing smile, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "You always were," she replied softly. As they continued onward, the light of the rising sun illuminated their path, casting long shadows behind them, but also revealing the open road ahead. Alaric walked a little taller, The burden of his past still there, but no longer defining him. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face it. Alaric and Maris made their way deeper into the valley, the landscape shifting as they approached the heart of the kingdom. The once untouched wilderness had given way to small villages, nestled on the edges of fertile land. Alaric's heart raced as he saw the familiar sight of his homeland. It was both comforting and terrifying. He had not set foot here in years. The air was thick with memories, the sound of children playing in the distance, the clatter of wagons in the marketplace. It was a place he had once loved, but now it felt like a distant dream. Maris walked beside him, noticing the change in his demeanor. She stopped and turned to him. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. Alaric's eyes were fixed ahead, his voice soft. "I have to be," he said quietly. "I don't have a choice anymore. The past, it won't let me move forward unless I face it." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch steadying him. "Then let's face it together." As they entered the village, Alaric could feel the eyes of the people on him. Whispers passed from one person to another as he walked by. He had been gone for too long, and the stories about him, his anger, his thirst for vengeance, were well known. But now, Alaric no longer recognized the person they were talking about. He had changed, but would they see that? His steps faltered as he reached the town square. The memories rushed back, the laughter of old friends, the faces of people he had once known. He had been a different man then, a man who believed that revenge could heal him. But now, he wasn't so sure. Maris, sensing his discomfort, stood beside him. "You don't have to do this alone," she reminded him softly. "You've already made the first step." Alaric nodded, his jaw tightening. "The hardest part is over," he said, taking a deep breath. "Now, I just have to make things right." Alaric walked into the town's inn, the door creaking as it swung open. The familiar smell of wood and the faint scent of ale filled the air. Behind the counter, an older man looked up, recognition flashing across his face. "Alaric," he said softly, as if unsure whether he should speak the name aloud. The last time Alaric had been here, things had ended badly. There had been shouting, accusations, and a bitter departure. But now, standing before him, Alaric felt an unfamiliar calm. The anger that had once consumed him was gone, replaced by something softer, something more akin to remorse. "I'm not the man I used to be," Alaric said, his voice low. I need to make amends." The innkeeper nodded, his eyes softening. "We all change," he replied, "but not all of us know how to." Alaric swallowed hard, the weight of the past pressing down on him once more. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. "I'm ready to try," he whispered. That night, as they sat outside by the fire, Alaric found himself deep in thought. He had always believed that he could only find peace through retribution, that he could only heal through the destruction of those who had wronged him. But now, sitting in the quiet, surrounded by the faint crackling of the fire and the sound of the wind through the trees, he realized how wrong he had been. The fire flickered in front of him, casting light on the darkened landscape. Maris sat across from him, watching the flames. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft and introspective, "we carry the weight of our past so heavily that we can't see the future. But the future is always waiting for us to step into it." Alaric nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I've been afraid of facing the past," he confessed. "Afraid of what it might do to me. But now I think I'm ready. I think I can finally move forward." Maris smiled, her eyes warm. "You've always been ready. You just needed to see it for yourself." The next morning, as they prepared to continue their journey, Alaric stood in front of the inn, his heart steady for the first time in years. The town was waking up around him, the sounds of morning bustling filling the air. The people who had once seen him as a threat now saw him differently. They saw him as a man who had faced his past and was ready to build something new. He turned to Maris, who had been by his side through it all. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. She smiled softly, her gaze affectionate yet resolute. "You've always had the strength inside you, Alaric. I was just here to remind you of it." Alaric nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's go then," he said, his voice confident. "The road ahead is still long, but it's mine to walk now." And with that he turned, ready to face the future, and whatever it held. The road ahead seemed endless, yet with every step, Alaric felt the weight of his past begin to lift. Maris walked beside him, her presence a quiet strength that guided him forward. The journey had not been easy, and there were still days when he struggled to see the way. But now, the path felt clearer, his heart a little lighter. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to change, becoming more rugged and wild. The silence of the forest around them was broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. Alaric's mind wandered back to the people he had left behind, those who had once been his friends, his family. He wondered what they would think of him now, but he knew he couldn't look back. The future was ahead of him, and it was his to claim. "We're getting close," Maris said, breaking his reverie. Alaric nodded, a sense of resolve settling within him. "Let's see where this road leads," he said quietly. As the hours passed, they reached the edge of the forest and emerged into a clearing. Before them stood the remnants of a once great fortress. Its stone walls were weathered, overgrown with ivy, and crumbling under the weight of time. This was the place Alaric had once called home, the place where his story had begun, and where it would come to an end. The memories hit him like a wave, his father's stern voice, his mother's soft lullaby, the promise he had made to himself. But now, everything felt distant. The fortress that had once been a symbol of strength now stood as a monument to loss. "This is it?" Alaric said, his voice barely a whisper. Maris stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "It doesn't have to be the end," she said. "It can be the beginning of something new." Alaric looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps it was time to let go of the past. As they stepped closer to the ruins, Alaric felt the weight of every step. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble with the echoes of his past, each stone a reminder of the man he had once been. The gates of the fortress creaked as they pushed them open, the sound sending a shiver down Alaric's spine. Inside, the hall was empty, the air stale with the passage of time. Dust motes floated in the beams of light that filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the cold stone floor. Alaric paused in the center of the room, his breath catching in his throat. This was where it had all started. His rise to power, his fall from grace, the choices he had made. "It's strange," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "I thought I would find answers here, but all I see is what I lost." Maris stood beside him, her gaze soft. "Sometimes answers aren't found in the past. They're found in what we choose to do next." The evening passed in quiet contemplation. As night fell, they sat outside the fortress, the sky turning a deep shade of purple as the stars began to twinkle above them. Alaric had never felt more alone, and yet more at peace. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. The fire crackled beside them, its warm glow a contrast to the cool night air. Maris sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way," she said quietly, "but you're not alone anymore." Alaric met her gaze, his heart heavy with gratitude. "I know. I couldn't have made it this far without you." He paused, then added, "I don't know what comes next, but I'm not afraid of it anymore." Maris smiled, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to keep moving forward." The next morning, Alaric stood at the edge of the ruins, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the landscape. It was a new day, and with it came the possibility of a new beginning. The past, for all its weight, was behind him. The choices he had made, the mistakes he had lived with, no longer defined him. He had a chance now to build something different, to make peace with himself. Maris joined him, her presence a steady comfort. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Alaric turned to her, his face resolute. "I think I always have been," he replied, his voice strong and unwavering. "It's time to move forward. Whatever happens next, I'm ready to face it." Together, they turned and began walking toward the horizon, the future wide open before them. The journey had taken them far, but the final test loomed ahead. Alaric and Maris stood on the precipice of a great mountain, the summit hidden in the clouds. The air was thin, and the wind howled around them. It was here that Alaric would face the consequences of his past decisions, where he would either find redemption or face his ultimate failure. His heart raced, but there was no turning back. "This is it," Alaric said, his voice low but steady. Maris placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a silent support. "We've come this far together," she said, her voice warm and confident. "Whatever happens now, you are not alone." Alaric nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something greater. He had to face his demons and finally put them to rest. Together, they began their climb, step by step, knowing that the path would test everything they had. The climb was treacherous, and every step felt like a battle. The wind whipped at their faces and the rocky path was narrow and unforgiving. Yet Alaric pressed on, each movement fueled by a quiet determination. Maris followed closely behind, her presence a constant source of strength. Wow! As they neared the summit, Alaric felt the weight of his past, the mistakes, the regrets, all pressing on him. But it was here at this moment that he understood. The mountain was not just a physical challenge. It was a symbol of his inner struggle. The higher he climbed, the closer he came to confronting the very essence of who he was. "Almost there," Maris said, her voice cutting through the howling wind. Alaric didn't respond, but his mind was clear. He had come too far to turn back now. The final reckoning was waiting for him at the top. When they finally reached the summit, the air was still. The storm had passed, and the world below seemed distant and small. Alaric stood at the edge, looking out over the vast expanse before him. The weight of the journey, the pain, the loss, it all seemed to dissipate in the calm of this moment. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Maris stood beside him, watching the horizon as well. "We did it," she said softly. Alaric nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over, the past is gone." He turned to her, his expression resolute. "Now, we can move forward." Maris smiled, a sense of pride in her eyes. "Yes, together we can." Alaric felt the finality of those words. There was no more fighting, no more running. The path ahead was open, and whatever came next, he would face it with strength and courage, not as a man bound by his past, but as someone reborn. As the days passed, Alaric and Maris descended the mountain, no longer burdened by the weight of their past. The world below seemed different now, brighter, more full of possibility. They traveled together, taking each step with a newfound sense of freedom. Alaric no longer saw himself as the man who had once been consumed by vengeance. He had learned that the true power lay not in revenge, but in redemption. His journey had taught him that forgiveness, both of others and himself, was the key to healing. As they approached a small village, Alaric paused, looking at Maris. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And we're just getting started." Maris smiled, her eyes full of warmth. "The best part of any journey is the path ahead." Alaric nodded, his heart lighter than it had ever been. He had no idea where the road would lead, but for the first time, he was excited to find out. The village was quiet, a place of simplicity and serenity. Alaric and Maris entered, greeted by the curious eyes of the villagers. They found a place to rest, a humble inn where they could regroup and begin to plan for the future. Alaric sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, his thoughts drifting to everything he had learned on this journey. He had sought revenge, but in the end he had found something far more valuable. He had found peace, and with it, a chance to rebuild the life he had once lost. Maris joined him at the window, her presence a constant source of strength. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet curiosity. Alaric smiled, his gaze softening. "Now we live. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Maris nodded, a smile forming on her lips. "Together." The world outside seemed brighter now, and for the first time in a long time, Alaric felt ready to embrace it.